Marcus Ellis had been praying all week for this moment. His daughter's worried eyes haunted him as he walked toward the most important job interview of his life. Outside the building, he saw a woman struggling with heavy boxes. She looked overwhelmed. Marcus checked his watch. He was already cutting it close. He should have kept walking. Instead, he stopped to help. That woman was Vivian Carlisle, CEO of a billion-dollar company. She was so impressed by his kindness that she cancelled her own meeting to talk with him. When she learned about his background as a veteran and single father, she offered him something bigger than any job. She offered him a chance to change lives. What if the moment that changes everything isn't when we chase our dreams, but when we stop to help someone else? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of the studio apartment at 5:30 in the morning, just as it had every day for the past 18 months. Marcus Ellis rolled over and silenced it with practiced precision, careful not to wake 7-year-old Zoe, who slept peacefully on the fold-out couch just 10 feet away. The cramped space that served as their living room by day transformed into her bedroom each night, a routine they had perfected since losing their 2-bedroom apartment. Marcus sat on the edge of his air mattress, running calloused hands through graying hair that seemed to be surrendering more ground to silver each month. At 38, he felt decades older, carrying the weight of responsibilities that had aged him beyond his years. The eviction notice crumpled in yesterday's pants pocket served as a constant reminder that time was running out. Again, his fingers instinctively found the chain around his neck, sliding along the metal until they reached the familiar weight of his military dog tags. The engraved letters had worn smooth over the years. Ellis Marcus J. The tags had survived 3 tours overseas, witnessed moments of brotherhood and loss that civilians could never understand, and now they hung against his chest like a talisman from another life. A life when he had purpose, when he led men who trusted him with their lives, when his decisions mattered beyond whether they would have heat this winter. The coffee maker gurgled to life, a sound that had become Marcus's morning meditation. He had bought the ancient machine at a thrift store, and despite its temperamental nature, it produced coffee strong enough to fuel hope on the darkest mornings. As the rich aroma filled the small space, Marcus allowed himself these quiet moments before the day's battles began. "Daddy?" Zoe's voice drifted across the room, soft and sleep-heavy. "Is it time for school?" "Not yet, princess. Few more minutes." Marcus kept his voice low and gentle, the tone he had perfected during those late nights when nightmares, his or hers, interrupted their peace. "Go back to sleep." But Zoe was already sitting up, her wild curls creating a halo around her face. In the early morning light, filtering through their single window, she had inherited her mother's beautiful features and quick mind, but thankfully none of Diane's restlessness. Where Diane had fled when the responsibilities became too real, Zoe possessed an old soul's acceptance of their circumstances. "You're wearing your interview clothes," she observed, her 7-year-old eyes taking in details that most adults missed. "The important one today?" Marcus looked down at the navy suit he had laid out the night before, the one decent outfit he owned. He had worn it to Diane's brother's wedding 2 years ago, back when they still received family invitations, back when their address wasn't a source of quiet embarrassment. The suit hung loose now, his frame having shed 20 pounds of muscle since his discharge from the army. Physical training had been replaced by the stress diet of uncertainty and the exhaustion of working multiple part-time jobs that never quite added up to stability. That's right, the one at the big building downtown. Marcus moved to the kitchenette, pouring coffee into a mug that proclaimed "World's Greatest Dad" in faded letters. Zoe had given it to him last Father's Day, bought with quarters she had saved from her school lunch money. The gesture had meant more than any commendation he had earned in the service. Zoe padded across the cold floor in her worn pajamas, settling into the kitchen chair that wobbled despite Marcus's repeated attempts to repair it. Everything in there. World required constant maintenance, constant attention to prevent complete collapse. What kind of job is it? Operations manager at a logistics company. The words felt foreign in his mouth, corporate speak that bore no resemblance to the work that had once defined him. Leading supply convoys through hostile territory, coordinating complex operations where lives hung in the balance, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between coming home and flag-draped coffins. Now he was interviewing to manage shipping schedules and warehouse inventories. That sounds boring, Zoe said with the brutal honesty of childhood. Marcus laughed despite himself, the sound echoing off their bare walls. It does, doesn't it? But boring jobs pay the bills, and that's what matters right now. He began preparing. Her breakfast, the same routine they had perfected over months of practice. Toast with peanut butter, cut diagonally the way she preferred. A glass of milk that he measured carefully, aware that the gallon needed to last until Friday's paycheck from his weekend job at the home improvement store. Orange juice was a luxury they saved for special occasions, though he couldn't remember the last time they had celebrated anything worth the expense. Mrs. Chen says you worry too much, Zoe announced between bites, referencing their elderly neighbor who had become their unofficial grandmother figure. Mrs. Chen lived in the apartment next door, her unit identical to theirs, but somehow more spacious, filled with the accumulated wisdom and possessions of 78 years. Mrs. Chen says a lot of things, Marcus replied, but his tone carried affection. The retired teacher had appointed herself their guardian angel, watching Zoe when Marcus worked late shifts, offering gentle advice wrapped in observations about the weather or comments about the building's maintenance issues. She never made their circumstances feel like charity, somehow managing to help while preserving Marcus's dignity. She says, good things happen to good people, but sometimes they take a long time to arrive. Marcus paused in his morning preparations, struck by the simple profundity of Mrs. Chen's words, filtered through his daughter's interpretation. Good things happen to good people. He wanted to believe that, had built his life on the assumption that integrity and hard work would eventually be rewarded. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Good people lost their homes. Good people watched their children go to bed hungry. Good people discovered that the world had little use for their particular set of skills once those skills were no longer needed by the military. She's a wise lady, he said finally, not wanting to burden Zoe with his doubts. The morning routine continued with practiced efficiency. Marcus helped Zoe dress for school, braiding her hair with the competence of a man who had learned to be both father and mother. He packed her lunch in a brown paper bag, the same sandwich and apple combination that stretched their grocery budget while ensuring she had proper nutrition. Her backpack was carefully organized. Homework completed at the kitchen table under the light of their single lamp, pencils sharpened to perfect points. Will you get the job today, Daddy? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the weight of their circumstances. Marcus knelt down to Zoe's eye level, placing his hands on her small shoulders. Her trust in him was absolute, unwavering, despite all the disappointments and broken promises that had brought them to this moment. She believed in him the way soldiers had once believed in him, with the kind of faith that made a man want to be worthy of it. I'm going to do my best, he said, the same answer he gave to every question about their future. It was honest without being hopeful, realistic without crushing the optimism that somehow survived in her young heart. Mrs. Chen's door opened as they stepped into the hallway, the timing too perfect to be coincidental. She emerged wearing her usual cardigan and comfortable shoes, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun that spoke of decades of teaching children who needed structure and kindness in equal measure. Good morning, sunshine, she said to Zoe, then turned to Marcus with eyes that seemed to see everything. You look very professional today. Important meeting? Job interview, Marcus replied, adjusting his tie one final time. The fabric felt foreign against his throat. a noose of respectability that he wore for the benefit of people who would judge him in the first 30 seconds. Ah, Mrs. Chen nodded as if this explained everything. I will walk our girl to school. Today, you focus on showing them who you are. The offer was phrased as a statement, removing any possibility of refusal or guilt. Mrs. Chen had mastered the art of helping without making it feel like charity, a skill that Marcus both appreciated and envied. He watched as she took Zoe's hand, their routine as natural as if they had been family for generations, rather than neighbors for months. Thank you, Marcus said, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Good people attract good. Opportunities, Mrs. Chen replied, her accent adding gravity to the observation. Sometimes they just take the long way around. Marcus kissed Zoe goodbye, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the innocence that still clung to her, despite everything they had faced. She hugged him fiercely, her small arms surprisingly strong. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Princess. See you tonight. He watched them walk down the hallway, Mrs. Chen's measured pace matching Zoe's shorter stride, their conversation already animated despite the early hour. When they disappeared around the corner, Marcus allowed himself a moment of gratitude for the unexpected kindnesses that had sustained them through the worst of times. The walk to the bus stop took him through neighborhoods that told the story of economic transition. Streets that had once housed the working middle class now displayed the subtle signs of struggle. Windows patched with tape, lawns surrendering to weeds, for rent signs that stayed up for months. Marcus recognized the residents' faces from his own mirror, people who had done everything right and discovered that right was no longer enough. The downtown bus carried a cross-section of the city's workforce. Hospital orderlies heading to early shifts, office cleaners finishing overnight, assignments, construction workers whose calloused hands matched Marcus's own. He found a seat near the back, reviewing his prepared answers to the inevitable questions about his employment gap, his military experience, his reasons for leaving his last position. The truth was complicated, messy in ways that didn't fit neatly into interview responses. He had tried to transition from military leadership to civilian management, but the corporate world operated by different rules. The decisive leadership style that had saved lives in combat was viewed as aggressive in boardrooms. The ability to improvise solutions under pressure became inflexibility when dealing with bureaucracy. The loyalty that had defined his military service was seen as naivety in a business environment where layoffs were strategic decisions rather than personal failures. As the bus pulled into downtown, Marcus caught his reflection in the window. The man staring back looked tired but determined, worn down by circumstances but not broken. His dog tags shifted beneath his shirt as he stood, a reminder of the strength that had carried him through worse situations than a job interview. The city's financial district rose around him as he walked toward his destination, glass and steel, monuments to success that felt as foreign as another planet. People in expensive suits moved with the confidence that came from secure paychecks and predictable futures. Marcus straightened his shoulders and walked among them, carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had led troops through desert, storms and midnight raids. He was still that man, even if the world no longer had a place for what he offered. The interview was at 9 o'clock. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, using the time to study the building directory, familiarize himself with the layout, and prepare mentally for the performance ahead. Success would mean stability for Zoe, a chance to move to a better neighborhood, the opportunity to plan beyond next month's rent. Failure would mean starting over again. As Marcus adjusted his tie one final time and walked toward the elevator, he had no way of knowing that the most important moment of his life was waiting. For him, not in a conference room, but on the sidewalk outside, where a woman he had never met was struggling with boxes that were too heavy and a schedule that was too tight. Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as interruptions. Marcus stepped out of the revolving glass doors into the crisp morning air, checking his watch one final time. 8:55, perfect timing for a 9 o'clock interview. The autumn breeze carried the scent of coffee from nearby cafes and the distant hum of traffic that never quite stopped in the city's heart. He took 3 steps toward the building's main entrance when he heard it, a frustrated sigh, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting concrete. To his right, near the curved driveway where expensive cars dropped off even more expensive executives, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit was wrestling with an oversized cardboard box that had clearly gotten the better of her. "Come on," she muttered, trying to lift the box while juggling a briefcase, her phone, and what appeared to be presentation materials threatening to spill across the sidewalk. Marcus paused. His interview was in 5 minutes. The elevator ride to the 15th floor would take 2 minutes. Security check-in might take another minute or 2. He had planned for contingencies, but not for this kind of delay. The woman tried again, bending at an awkward angle to get leverage on the box. Her professional facade was cracking under the weight of logistics gone wrong, and Marcus could see the stress building in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at her watch, the tightness around her eyes that spoke of schedules that couldn't afford disruption. Every rational thought told him to keep walking. This wasn't his problem. He had his own crisis to solve, his own future hanging in the balance 15 floors above his head. Zoe's worried face flashed through his mind. The eviction notice in his pocket, the dwindling balance in their bank account. Instead, Marcus found himself stepping toward the struggling woman. "Ma'am, looks like you could use a hand with that." She straightened, pushing a strand of auburn hair back from her face, and Marcus got his first clear look at her. She was probably in her early 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of corner offices and board meetings. But her expression held genuine surprise at his offer, as if kindness from strangers was an unexpected commodity in her world. Yes, actually, that would be wonderful." Her voice carried the hint of an accent, something East Coast refined but not quite Boston. "I'm afraid I overestimated my ability to manage all of this alone." Marcus set his briefcase down and approached the box, quickly assessing its weight and bulk. The label read, "Presentation Materials, Handle with Care." Whatever was inside was important enough to warrant personal transport rather than courier. "Delivery. Here, let me get that for you." He squatted and lifted with his legs, the way the army had taught him to handle heavy equipment without injury. The box was substantial but manageable, filled with what felt like bound reports and possibly electronic equipment. "Oh my goodness, thank you." The relief in her voice was genuine. "I was starting to think I'd have to make 3 trips, and my presentation starts in..." She checked her watch again. 7 minutes. "Where does it need to go?" "Just to the elevator bank inside. I can manage from there." She gathered her scattered materials, while Marcus carried the box toward the building entrance. "I'm Vivian, by the way. Vivian Carlyle. Marcus Ellis. Happy to help." The name didn't register immediately, though something about her bearing suggested importance beyond the obvious business attire. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her time managed by others, her problems solved by staff members who anticipated needs before they became crises. Inside the marble-clad lobby, Marcus set the box down near the elevator bank as requested. The security guard nodded at Vivian with the deference reserved for familiar faces, and Marcus realized she wasn't just visiting this building, she belonged here. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate this," Vivian said, extending her hand, for a firm handshake. Her grip was confident, direct, the kind of handshake that closed deals and made first impressions count. "You just saved my morning." Marcus glanced at the elevator display. 2 minutes past 9. His interview was officially starting without him, but he felt surprisingly calm about the delay. "Glad I could help. Are you here for a meeting?" she asked, and Marcus heard genuine interest in the question rather than polite conversation. "Job interview, actually. Though I'm afraid I'm now officially late." Vivian's eyebrows rose. "Which company?" "Meridian Logistics, 15th floor." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition followed by what might have been concern. "I know Meridian. Good company, but—" She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "What kind of position?" "Operations manager. Overseeing. Warehouse distribution and supply chain coordination." Marcus had practiced the description until it sounded natural, though the work bore little resemblance to anything that had ever inspired him. Vivian was quiet for a moment, studying him with the intensity of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of people's capabilities. Whatever she saw seemed to interest her more than her abandoned presentation upstairs. "What's your background?" The question was casual, but Marcus sensed layers beneath it. Military, logistics and personnel management, 3 tours overseas, then transition to civilian sector. He kept the summary brief, professional, avoiding the complications that didn't fit neatly into elevator conversations. "How long since discharge?" 2 years. Marcus checked his watch again. 5 minutes late now, but Vivian's attention felt more important than punctuality. Something about her question suggested this conversation was heading somewhere unexpected. "And you're interested in warehouse management?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most people accepted career pivots without question, understanding that civilian employment often bore little resemblance to military expertise. But Vivian's tone suggested she saw the disconnect between his background and his current pursuits. "I'm interested in employment," Marcus replied honestly. "Stable employment that lets me provide for my daughter." The admission surprised him. He rarely mentioned Zoe in professional contexts, understanding that single parenthood could be viewed as a liability rather than motivation. But something about Vivian's demeanor invited honesty rather than calculated responses. "Single father?" "Yes." "Ma'am." Vivian nodded, and Marcus saw recognition in her expression, not pity, but understanding of the pressures that drove good people to accept less than they deserved. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a business card, but instead of handing it to him immediately, she held it while asking another question. "What did you do in the military?" "Specifically, supply chain management in hostile environments, personnel leadership under pressure, resource allocation when everything went wrong and lives depended on getting it right." The words came out with more passion than Marcus had intended, revealing his frustration with the gap between his capabilities and civilian opportunities. In the army, his decisions had mattered. People had trusted him with responsibilities that required both technical expertise and moral courage. Now he was interviewing for positions that reduced those same skills to inventory management and efficiency. Metrics, and you miss it. It wasn't a question, and Marcus appreciated that she didn't pretend otherwise. "I miss the sense of purpose, the feeling that what I did mattered beyond profit margins." Vivian handed him the business card, but her eyes never left his face. "I have a proposition for you, Marcus Ellis." The card was elegant in its simplicity, thick stock, minimalist design, raised lettering that spelled out Vivian Carlisle, Chief Executive Officer, Carlisle Technologies. Below that, contact information for what Marcus now realized was one of the largest technology conglomerates on the East Coast. "I'm about to go into a board meeting where I'm supposed to present a new initiative, a project I've been developing for months. Something that requires exactly the kind of leadership experience you just described." She paused, and Marcus could see her making a decision in real time. "I'm going to cancel that meeting. Ma'am, you don't need to. I've been looking for the right person to lead this initiative for 6 months. Posted positions, interviewed dozens of candidates, worked with headhunters who specialize in non-profit management and community development. Know what they all had in common?" Marcus shook his head. They had impressive resumes and no real understanding of what it means to serve something larger than yourself. They could talk about social impact and community engagement, but none of them had ever actually put their life on the line for people they barely knew. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Vivian stepped aside to let other passengers board. When it was gone, she continued, "You just sacrificed your own interview to help a complete stranger with her boxes. That tells me more about your character than any reference check ever could." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him, the familiar sensation of a situation developing beyond his control. "I appreciate the sentiment, but I should probably try to salvage my interview with Meridian. Trust me, you don't want that job." Vivian's tone carried the authority of insider knowledge. "They're good people, but they'll have you managing warehouse rotations until you're too old to remember. Why you wanted something more meaningful?" She reached for her phone, speed dialing a number with practiced efficiency. "Janet, I need to postpone the 10 o'clock board presentation. Family emergency. Reschedule for tomorrow. Same time." She hung up before her assistant could respond, then turned back to Marcus. "Do you have an hour to spare, Marcus? There's a coffee shop around the corner where I'd like to tell you about something that might interest you. Something that could use your particular set of skills." Marcus looked at the business card again, processing the implications. Carlisle Technologies was a name he recognized from Business News, a company whose charitable foundation was regularly featured in stories about corporate social responsibility. Vivian Carlisle wasn't just a CEO, she was someone whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions in community investments, and she was offering to buy him coffee based on 30 seconds of helping with boxes. "I should mention," she continued, reading his hesitation, "this isn't charity. It's not a feel-good program designed to make wealthy people feel better about themselves. What I'm talking about is real work, with real challenges and real impact, the kind of work that matters." The elevator arrived again, and this time Vivian pressed the button to hold the doors open. "So what do you say, Marcus Ellis? Are you willing to hear about an opportunity that might actually be worthy of what you have to offer?" Marcus thought about the interview happening 15 floors above them, the questions he had prepared to answer, the corporate environment that would never quite fit his particular combination of skills and values. Then he thought about Zoe, about Mrs. Chen's words, about good things taking the long way around, about the possibility that sometimes the best opportunities came disguised as interruptions. He stepped into the elevator beside Vivian Carlisle. "I'd like to hear about it." The apartment felt smaller when Marcus returned at 11:30, the walls seeming to close in as he processed what had just happened. He stood in their tiny kitchenette, Vivian Carlisle's business card still warm in his palm, trying to reconcile the morning's events with the reality of his surroundings. The contrast was jarring. 2 hours ago he had been sitting across from one of the most powerful women in the city, and now he was back to counting the remaining coffee filters and wondering if they could stretch the milk until Friday. The conversation had been unlike any job interview he had ever experienced. Vivian had bought him coffee at a small cafe 3 blocks from her office building, choosing a corner table away from the morning rush of professionals grabbing their caffeine fixes before important meetings. She had asked questions that had nothing to do with his resume and everything to do with who he was beneath the circumstances that had brought him to that interview. Marcus moved to the window, looking down at the courtyard where Mrs. Chen was hanging laundry on the communal clothesline. The sight of his neighbor going about her daily routine helped ground him, reminding him that life continued its steady rhythm regardless of the extraordinary interruptions that occasionally threatened to upend everything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Zoe's school contact, checking the time. She would be in math class now, working through multiplication problems with the same determined concentration she brought to everything. The thought of her trusting face made his chest tight with the weight of possibility and responsibility in equal measure. The business card lay on their scarred kitchen table, elegant and official against the backdrop of their modest breakfast dishes. Marcus had read it a dozen times during the bus ride home, each reading confirming that it was real, that the morning had actually happened. Vivian Carlisle, CEO, the woman who had built a technology empire from a small software company her father had started in his garage 30 years ago. During their coffee conversation, She had told him about her initiative, a comprehensive program designed to identify and develop overlooked talent in underserved communities. The goal was ambitious: create pathways for people whose potential had been buried under economic necessity, family obligations, or simple lack of opportunity. It was exactly the kind of work that the younger version of himself had imagined doing. After his military service, before the reality of single parenthood and financial survival had narrowed his options to whatever paid the bills. The problem, Vivian had explained, stirring sugar into her coffee with precise movements, is that most programs like this are designed by people who have never actually lived the experiences they're trying to address. They mean well, but they don't understand the real barriers that keep good people trapped in cycles of underemployment. Marcus had found himself leaning forward, engaged in a way he hadn't felt during any civilian job discussion. What makes you think you understand? Those barriers? She had smiled at that, appreciating the directness of his challenge. I don't. That's why I need someone who does. Someone who has navigated those challenges personally and can design solutions that actually work for real people facing real constraints. The memory of her words stirred something in Marcus that he had thought was permanently buried under 2 years of rejection letters and compromised dreams. The feeling of being needed for something that mattered, of having his specific combination, of experiences viewed as assets rather than complications. His phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting his reflection. The name on the screen made him smile. Mrs. Chen had finally learned to use the texting function on the simple smartphone. Her grandson had bought her for Christmas. How was the important meeting? Marcus stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How did you explain that your day had taken a turn so unexpected that you were still processing whether it had actually happened? That a routine job interview had somehow transformed into a conversation about changing lives and creating opportunities for people who looked like him. He typed back, "Different than expected, good different." The response came quickly. "Good different is the best kind. We'll tell Zoe you are home safe." Marcus set the phone down and moved to their small couch, settling into the worn cushions that had come with the furnished apartment. The space held all their possessions now: clothes that fit in a single dresser, books that filled 2 boxes, kitchen supplies that barely justified the term furnished. It was temporary, they had told themselves when they moved in 18 months ago, a brief stopover while Marcus found his footing in the civilian job market. Looking around now, he could see how temporary had slowly become indefinite, how survival mode had gradually replaced any real planning for the future. The apartment wasn't just small. It was a symbol of all the compromises he had made, all the dreams he had scaled back in service of immediate necessity. But Vivian's offer represented something different. She had outlined a position that would use his military leadership experience, his understanding of resource management under pressure, and his personal knowledge of what it meant to be overlooked despite having valuable skills. The work would involve developing programs, yes, but also working directly with participants, mentoring people who needed someone who understood their struggles firsthand. The salary she had mentioned was more than double what the Meridian Logistics position would have paid. Enough to move Zoe to a better school district, to stop worrying about whether the utilities would stay connected, to begin building the stable life he had been promising his daughter for 2 years. But beyond the financial security, Vivian had offered something more valuable, the opportunity to matter again. Marcus reached for the pad of paper they kept by the phone, an old habit from his military days when important information was always backed up in writing. He began making notes, trying to capture the details of their conversation before they faded into the surreal haze of too good to be true. The program would start with a pilot initiative in 3 communities, focusing on adults who had been pushed out of traditional career pathways by circumstances beyond their control. Veterans, single parents, people who had been incarcerated, immigrants whose credentials weren't recognized. the populations that existing programs either ignored or approached with condescending charity rather than genuine respect. The goal, Vivian had said, isn't to help people get jobs, it's to help them build careers, to identify their actual strengths and create pathways that use those strengths effectively. We're not looking for people who fit into existing boxes. We're looking for people who can help us build better boxes. Marcus had asked the hard questions about funding, about sustainability, about what happened if the program didn't produce immediate results. Vivian's answers had been thoughtful, realistic, and backed by research that showed she had been developing this initiative for months, not making impulsive decisions based on a chance encounter with a helpful stranger. The position would require him to spend time in each of the target communities, meeting with local leaders, understanding specific challenges and opportunities. He would be responsible for designing intake processes, developing mentorship programs, and creating partnerships with employers who were genuinely committed to hiring based on potential rather than traditional credentials. It was exactly the kind of work that had drawn him to military service initially. The opportunity to lead people through difficult situations, to solve complex problems with human solutions, to make decisions that improved lives in measurable ways. The apartment door opened, and Zoe's voice filled the space, bright with the excitement of a 7-year-old who had something important to share. "Daddy!" Mrs. Chen said you came home early. Did you get the job? Marcus turned to see his daughter dropping her backpack by the door, her school uniform slightly disheveled from a day of learning and playground adventures. Behind her, Mrs. Chen smiled and waved before disappearing back into her own apartment, giving them privacy for what she clearly understood was an important conversation. "Come here, Princess," Marcus said, patting the couch cushion beside him. "I have something interesting to tell you." The conference room on the 42nd floor of Carlisle Technologies offered a view of the city that Marcus had never seen before. From this height, the streets below looked orderly, purposeful, as if the chaos and struggle of daily life had been organized into neat patterns by distance and perspective. He sat across from Vivian at a polished mahogany table that could have seated 20 people, a manila folder thick with documents positioned between them like a bridge between his old life and whatever came next. 3 days had passed since their coffee conversation. 3 days during which Marcus had researched everything he could find about Carlisle Technologies, their charitable foundation, and Vivian herself. What he had discovered was impressive and slightly intimidating. A company that had grown from a family business to a multinational corporation while maintaining a reputation for ethical practices and employee satisfaction. Vivian's leadership was regularly featured in business magazines, not just for her financial acumen, but for her innovative approach to corporate responsibility. "I want to be completely transparent about what we're proposing," Vivian said, sliding the folder across the table. "This isn't a traditional non-profit position. It's not corporate social responsibility dressed up with good intentions. What we're talking about is a fundamental shift in how we identify and develop human potential." Marcus opened the folder to reveal a comprehensive proposal document, professionally bound and illustrated with charts, demographic data, and projected outcomes. The first page bore the title, Community Empowerment Initiative, a strategic approach to unlocking overlooked talent. Below that, in smaller text, proposed director Marcus Ellis. Seeing his name on official corporate letterhead felt surreal, like glimpsing an alternate version of himself who had somehow escaped the limitations that had defined his post-military career. He turned the page and began reading, aware that Vivian was watching his reaction carefully. The scope was even more ambitious than their initial conversation had suggested. The pilot program would operate in 3 cities, each representing different demographic challenges. A Rust Belt community dealing with industrial decline, a rural area where agricultural changes had eliminated traditional employment, and an urban neighborhood where generational poverty had created systemic barriers to advancement. The budget for the first 2 years, Vivian said, pointing to a specific chart, is $8 million. That covers staffing, program development, participant support services, and outcome measurement. If the pilot succeeds, we're prepared to expand nationally within 5 years. Marcus studied the numbers, impressed by both their ambition and their realism. This wasn't a feel-good gesture designed to generate positive publicity. The financial commitment was substantial enough to attract serious attention from the company's board of directors, and the success metrics were specific enough to require real results rather than anecdotal feel-good stories. What makes you think this approach will work where others have failed? Marcus asked, the question carrying his genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Because most programs start with assumptions about what people need rather than understanding what they actually want, Vivian replied. We're not going to rescue anyone or save anyone. We're going to provide tools and opportunities for people to save themselves. She leaned forward, her intensity evident in the way she spoke about the initiative. This wasn't just a business venture for her. It was personal in ways that weren't immediately obvious. My father started this company with nothing but technical skills and determination. He succeeded because someone saw his potential and gave him a chance to prove himself. But he was lucky. He was a white man in the 1970s when the technology industry was just beginning to explode. Today, that same potential might never be recognized if it comes wrapped in the wrong circumstances. Marcus nodded, understanding the unstated implications. Potential was randomly distributed, but opportunities were not. The goal wasn't to find deserving people and lift them up. It was to remove the artificial barriers that prevented capable people from demonstrating their abilities. The 3 communities we've selected represent different types of challenges, Vivian continued, turning to a map that showed the proposed locations. But they all share one common characteristic. They contain people whose talents have been made invisible by economic circumstances. The first location was Millbrook, Ohio, a former manufacturing center where plant closures had left thousands of skilled workers without obvious paths forward. The second was Eastland County, North Carolina, where tobacco farming had given way to corporate agriculture, leaving small farmers and rural communities struggling to reinvent themselves. The third was the Riverside neighborhood in Detroit, where decades of disinvestment had created a community rich in resilience and innovation, but poor in traditional economic opportunities. Each location will have an on-site coordinator, Vivian explained. Someone who lives in the community, understands its specific dynamics, and can build trust with residents. But the overall program design, the strategic direction, the integration between sites, that's where we need someone with your background. Marcus turned to a section of the proposal that outlined his potential responsibilities. The role was complex, requiring both big-picture thinking and hands-on implementation. He would be responsible for developing intake processes that could identify potential in unconventional packages, creating mentorship programs that matched participants with successful professionals from similar backgrounds, and establishing partnerships with employers who were willing to hire based on demonstrated ability rather than traditional credentials. This is a significant risk for you, Marcus observed. $8 million on an unproven concept, led by someone with no experience in non-profit management or community development. That's exactly why it might work, Vivian replied. The experts have been trying to solve these problems for decades, using approaches that sound good in academic papers but don't translate to real-world results. We need someone who understands the problems from the inside, someone who has personally navigated the gap between potential and opportunity. She reached for another document, this one labeled Personnel Background Analysis. I had my team research your military service record, your performance evaluations, your leadership assessments, the feedback from soldiers under your command. The picture that emerges is of someone who excels at taking complex, chaotic situations and creating systems that allow people to succeed. Marcus felt a familiar tension in his chest, the same discomfort he experienced whenever his military service became the subject of civilian discussion. The accomplishments that looked impressive on paper had come with costs that didn't translate. To corporate environments, sleepless nights, impossible decisions, the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. Military leadership and community development aren't the same thing, he said. No, they're not, but the core skills transfer. The ability to assess people quickly and accurately, the capacity to make decisions with incomplete information, the experience of motivating people to achieve goals they didn't think were possible. Vivian stood and moved to the window, gesturing toward the city spread out below them. Most community development programs fail because they're designed by people who see problems rather than potential. They create systems that help people cope with their circumstances rather than systems that help people change their circumstances. She turned back to face him. You've spent your adult life identifying potential in people others might overlook, teaching them to do things they didn't know they could do, leading them through situations that required them to become more than they thought possible. Marcus closed the folder, processing the weight of what she was proposing. The opportunity was extraordinary, almost too good to believe. But extraordinary opportunities often came with extraordinary expectations, and he had learned to be cautious about promises that seemed to solve too many problems at once. I need to think about this, he said finally. Vivian smiled, and he could see that his hesitation pleased rather than disappointed her. Good. Anyone who would accept this kind of responsibility without serious consideration isn't someone I'd want leading it. She handed him a second business card, this one with her direct phone number written on the back. Take all the time you need. But Marcus, don't let the fear of failure prevent you from recognizing an opportunity that's genuinely worthy of what you have to offer. The Roosevelt Community Center occupied a brick building that had seen better decades, its facade marked by the kind of gentle decay that spoke of good intentions hampered by insufficient funding. Marcus climbed the front steps slowly, each footfall echoing against concrete that had been worn smooth by thousands of visitors, seeking everything from job training to hot meals to simply a safe place to spend their afternoons. It had been a week since his meeting with Vivian, 7 days of careful consideration punctuated by conversations that felt like auditions for his own future. Tonight was different. Tonight he was here not as Marcus the job seeker, but as Marcus the potential leader of something that could change lives in ways that mattered. The community room buzzed with familiar energy as he entered. Folding chairs, arranged in an imperfect circle, coffee brewing in an industrial-sized pot that had probably been donated years ago. People gathering with the mixture of hope and skepticism that characterized meetings promising to address problems that had persisted for generations. Marcus recognized several faces from his previous volunteer work. There was Sandra Williams, a single mother of 3 who had been trying to transition from factory work to healthcare administration for 2 years. Jerome Thompson, a veteran whose PTSD had derailed his initial attempts at civilian employment, but who possessed an intuitive understanding of electronics that had impressed everyone at the center. Maria Santos, an immigrant whose engineering degree from Columbia meant nothing to American employers despite her obvious expertise. Marcus Ellis, called out Reverend Washington from across the room, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection. Haven't seen you around here in a while. Heard through the grapevine you might have some interesting news to share. The Reverend approached with the easy confidence of a man who had spent 30 years serving his community through economic booms and busts, social changes and political upheavals. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made him both a spiritual leader and a practical advocate for neighborhood improvement. "Evening, Reverend. News might be putting it a bit strong, but there's definitely something I wanted to discuss with folks." "Good. We could use some positive developments around here." Reverend Washington gestured toward the growing crowd. "As you can see, word gets around fast when someone mentions new opportunities." Marcus surveyed the room, counting roughly 30 people ranging in age from their early 20s to their 60s. The demographic was exactly what Vivian's research had predicted: people with skills, experience, and ambition who had been pushed to the margins by circumstances beyond their control. They were here because they hadn't given up hope, but their expressions carried the wariness of people who had heard promises before. "Let me get everyone's attention," Reverend Washington said, moving to the front of the room. "Folks, most of you know Marcus Ellis. He's been volunteering here for the better part of 2 years, helping with job interview prep and resume writing. Tonight, he wanted to share something with us about a new program that might be of interest." The room quieted with the focused attention that came from people who understood that opportunities were rare and needed to be evaluated carefully. Marcus stood, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, measuring him against their hopes and their previous disappointments. "Thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to start by saying that what I'm about to describe is still in the development phase. Nothing is guaranteed. No promises are being made, and I'm here tonight to get your input on whether this idea makes sense from your perspective." A good opening, he thought. Honest about limitations while acknowledging that their opinions mattered. In the planning process, about a week ago, I had a conversation with someone who runs a major corporation here in the city. She's developing a program designed to identify and support people whose potential isn't being recognized through traditional channels. The goal is to create pathways to meaningful careers for people who have been overlooked by standard hiring practices. Sandra Williams raised her hand. "What kind of careers are we talking about? And how is this different from all the other job training programs that promise the world and deliver temp work?" Marcus appreciated the directness of her question. Sandra had been through multiple retraining programs, each promising to lead to stable employment, each ending with positions that paid barely above minimum wage and offered no real advancement opportunities. "That's exactly the right question to ask," Marcus replied. "The difference, at least in theory, is that this program starts by identifying what you're already good at, rather than trying to train you for whatever jobs happen to be available. The goal is to match people with opportunities that use their existing strengths and provide pathways for growth." Jerome leaned forward in his chair. "Sounds like every program ever created. We'll help you identify your strengths. Then they test you, decide you're good at following directions, and offer you warehouse work." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Jerome had articulated the fundamental problem with most job placement programs. They were designed to fill existing openings rather than create opportunities that matched people's actual capabilities. "I hear you," Marcus said. "And honestly, that's one of the reasons I'm here tonight. If this is going to work, it has to be designed by people who understand the real barriers you face. People who know the difference between a program that actually helps and a program that just makes the organizers feel good about themselves." He moved closer to the center of the circle, abandoning the formal presentation stance for something more conversational. "The woman I met with asked me to lead this initiative. Me, someone who's been unemployed or underemployed for the past 2 years, someone who understands what it's like to have your military experience viewed as irrelevant, someone who knows what it means to compromise your dreams because you need to pay rent." Maria Santos spoke up, her accented English precise and thoughtful. "What makes her think this will work? Rich people have been trying to solve our problems for decades. Usually they make things worse by creating programs that help them feel better while making us jump through more hoops." Marcus nodded, recognizing the frustration behind her words. Maria's engineering background should have made her immediately employable, but licensing requirements, credential recognition processes, and subtle bias had kept her trapped in retail positions that wasted her considerable talents. She thinks it will work because she's not trying to save anyone, Marcus replied. The goal is to remove barriers that prevent people from demonstrating what they can do, to create partnerships with employers who are looking for talent rather than credentials, to provide support systems that help people succeed rather than comply. The room was quiet as people processed this distinction. The difference between being saved and being supported was crucial, representing the gap between charity and empowerment. "So what would you need from us?" asked Mrs. Patterson, an older woman who had been displaced from her administrative position when her company downsized. "If this program happens, how do we know it won't be another situation where we do all the work and other people get the credit?" Marcus felt the question settle over the room like a challenge. These people had learned to be skeptical of outsiders bearing gifts, and their skepticism was based on hard experience with programs that had promised transformation but delivered disappointment. "The program succeeds only if you succeed," he said simply. "The measurements of success are job placement, career advancement, income improvement, and personal satisfaction. If those things don't happen for the people in this room, then the program fails, regardless of how good it looks on paper." He paused, looking around the circle at faces that reflected years of struggle, resilience, and carefully guarded hope. "But here's what I need to know from you. If someone offered you a real opportunity to use your skills in work that mattered, work that paid well, and had room for advancement, would you be willing to take the risk of trying again?" The knock on Marcus's apartment door came at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, just as he was helping Zoe with her homework. The geometric precision of the sound, 3 measured raps, followed by a pause, then 2 more, told him it wasn't. Mrs. Chen, whose arthritic knuckles produced a more tentative rhythm against the thin wood. "I'll get it, Daddy," Zoe announced, already pushing back from the kitchen table where her math worksheets lay scattered between dinner dishes that still needed washing. "Hold on, Princess. Let me check first." Marcus approached the door carefully, a habit from neighborhoods where unexpected visitors could mean problems. The peephole revealed a small, professionally dressed woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, holding what appeared to be an official document. She looked like a social worker or court official, which immediately triggered every protective instinct Marcus had developed as a single father navigating systems that viewed their family structure with suspicion. He opened the door, but kept the security chain engaged, creating a gap just wide enough for conversation. "Mr. Ellis, my name is Patricia Donnelly. I work with the Academic Excellence Foundation. I have some paperwork regarding your daughter Zoe's educational opportunities." The words were delivered with practiced efficiency, but Marcus detected something beneath the formal presentation. Excitement, perhaps, or the satisfaction of someone delivering good news that had been carefully orchestrated. "What kind of paperwork? May I come in?" "It's rather detailed, and I think you'll want to sit down when you see what we're offering." Marcus hesitated. The Academic Excellence Foundation was a name he had heard but never in connection with anything involving his family. They were the organization that provided scholarships to private schools, funded enrichment programs for gifted students, and generally operated in circles far removed from families living in studio apartments with eviction notices in their recent history. "Daddy, who is it?" Zoe called from the table, her 7-year-old curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "Just a minute, Zoe." Marcus unhooked the chain and stepped back to allow the woman entry, noting how her eyes quickly assessed their living situation without judgment. Professional in the way that suggested experience with families facing various economic circumstances. Patricia Donnelly moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed into homes where her arrival represented positive change. She approached Zoe's homework setup, smiling at the careful penmanship that filled the worksheets. "You must be Zoe. I'm Mrs. Donnelly. Your teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, speaks very highly of your work in mathematics." Zoe beamed at the praise, unconsciously, straightening in her chair. "I like math. Numbers make sense." "Indeed they do." Patricia turned back to Marcus, her expression becoming more businesslike. "Mr. Ellis, the Foundation has been reviewing academic performance data from schools throughout the district. Your daughter's test scores and classroom performance have caught our attention." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents, spreading them across the kitchen table with the practiced motion of someone who had made similar presentations many times before. "We'd like to offer Zoe a full scholarship to St. Catherine's Academy, including tuition, books, uniforms, and supplemental educational services. The scholarship would cover her education through high school graduation." Marcus felt the floor shift beneath his feet, the same sensation he had experienced when Vivian first offered him the community initiative position. The numbers on the documents swam slightly as he tried to process the information. Annual tuition amounts that exceeded their entire yearly income, educational opportunities that he had never imagined being within reach for his daughter. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "How did Zoe come to your attention? We never applied for any scholarship programs." Patricia smiled, with what might have been genuine warmth mixed with professional satisfaction. "Sometimes exceptional students are identified through routine academic assessments rather than through formal applications. The Foundation believes in proactive outreach to ensure that financial circumstances never prevent talented children from receiving appropriate educational challenges." She pointed to a series of test scores and academic evaluations that had been compiled over the past several months. Zoe's performance was consistently above grade level across multiple subjects, with particular strength in mathematical reasoning and reading comprehension. "St. Catherine's has an excellent track record of preparing students for competitive universities," Patricia continued. "Their graduating classes typically see 95% college acceptance rates, with significant merit scholarship awards for continuing education." Marcus looked at his daughter, who was following the conversation with the focused attention she brought to anything involving her future. At 7, she already understood that educational opportunities were connected to life possibilities, that the quality of her schooling would influence the range of choices available to her as an adult. "This is very generous," Marcus said carefully, "but I need to understand how this works. What's the catch? What's the Foundation's interest in Zoe specifically?" The question was pointed, carrying the wariness of a man who had learned to examine unexpected generosity for hidden costs or obligations. In his experience, no one offered valuable resources without expecting something in return, and he needed to understand what strings might be attached to this opportunity. "There's no catch, Mr. Ellis. The Academic Excellence Foundation was established by several local business leaders who believe that identifying and supporting talented students early in their educational journey produces the best long-term outcomes for both the students and the community." She handed him a brochure featuring photographs of diverse students engaged in various academic activities: science laboratories, computer programming classes, advanced mathematics seminars, college preparatory courses that looked nothing like the overcrowded classrooms of Zoe's current school. "The Foundation has been operating for 15 years. We currently support over 200 students across 12 schools in the metropolitan area. Our graduates have gone on to attend institutions like MIT, Stanford, Georgetown, and the University of Chicago." Marcus studied the brochure, noting the careful diversity of the photographed students, the high-quality facilities, the small class sizes that suggested individual attention rather than mass education. Everything about St. Catherine's Academy represented the kind of educational environment he had dreamed of providing for Zoe, but had never imagined being accessible given their financial circumstances. "Daddy?" Zoe said quietly. "Does this mean I would go to a different school?" The question was asked with the careful neutrality that children develop when they sense that adult decisions will significantly impact their lives. She was excited about the possibility, but cautious about expressing too much enthusiasm in case the opportunity disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. "It might, Princess, but only if it's something that would make you happy." Patricia reopened her briefcase and withdrew another set of documents. "There are some enrollment forms that would need to be completed, but the scholarship is firm. We'd like to have Zoe start at the beginning of the next academic year, which gives you several months to make the transition." She paused, studying Marcus with the assessing gaze of someone who had learned to read parental concerns quickly and accurately. "Mr. Ellis, I should mention that the Foundation also provides family support services. We understand that when children transition to more demanding academic environments, the entire family unit benefits from additional resources. We offer career counseling, financial planning assistance, and networking opportunities for scholarship." Families. The words hit Marcus with uncomfortable precision, as if Patricia somehow knew about his recent career discussions, his conversations with Vivian, his struggle to balance Zoe's needs with his own professional uncertainty. The coincidence felt too convenient, too perfectly timed, to be purely coincidental. "Who nominated Zoe for this scholarship?" he asked directly. Patricia smiled with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for his directness. "The Foundation receives recommendations from various sources, teachers, community leaders, business professionals who are committed to educational excellence. Sometimes our most successful placements come from people who recognize potential in circumstances where others might only see challenges." The explanation was smoothly delivered, but deliberately vague, the kind of non-answer that provided information without revealing sources. Marcus found himself thinking about Vivian, about their conversation regarding overlooked talent, about the timing of opportunities that seemed almost too perfectly aligned to be mere coincidence. "Can we think about this?" he asked. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Mr. Ellis, opportunities like this don't come along often. Your daughter has exceptional potential. It would be a shame to let financial circumstances limit what she might achieve." Marcus stood outside the Academic Excellence Foundation offices at 8 in the morning, having arrived 30 minutes before they opened. The building was located in the financial district, its glass facade reflecting the early sunlight in patterns that suggested both transparency and impenetrability. He had spent most of the night researching the organization, following digital trails that led to board members, funding sources, and connections that painted a picture more complex than Patricia Donnelly's carefully neutral presentation had suggested. The foundation was legitimate, their track record of student success genuine. But buried in the fine print of their annual reports and donor acknowledgements, Marcus had discovered something that had kept him awake until dawn. Carlyle Technologies was their largest corporate sponsor, and Vivian Carlyle herself served on their executive advisory board. The security guard let him into the lobby at 8:15, directing him to the reception area, where he waited with the focused patience that military service had taught him. When Patricia Donnelly emerged from the elevator at 8:30, her expression showed no surprise at finding him there, as if she had expected his early arrival and had prepared for whatever conversation would follow. "Mr. Ellis, I hope you're not here to decline our offer on Zoe's behalf." "I'm here to understand who's really making the offer," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level despite the anger that had been building since his 3 a.m. discovery of the Carlyle connection. Patricia gestured toward a conference room off the main lobby, holding the door while Marcus entered. The space was professionally decorated but impersonal, designed for conversations that needed privacy, without the comfort that might encourage extended discussion. "Please sit down." Marcus remained standing. "How long has Vivian Carlyle been tracking my family?" The directness of his question seemed to please Patricia rather than disturb her. She settled into her chair and regarded him with the calm assessment of someone who had anticipated this confrontation. Ms. Carlyle identified Zoe as a potential scholarship candidate approximately 6 months ago, well before your meeting with her. The identification came through routine academic performance screening that the Foundation conducts in partnership with the school district. 6 months ago. Marcus processed the timeline, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with uncomfortable precision, which means she knew about my daughter before she offered me the community initiative position. Yes. And the timing of the scholarship offer, 3 days after my meeting with her, that's just coincidence. Patricia smiled with what might have been genuine appreciation for his intelligence. Mr. Ellis, you're asking the right questions. Yes, the timing was accelerated based on Ms. Carlyle's recommendation, but the scholarship itself was already approved through our standard evaluation process. She opened a folder on the table between them, revealing documents that Marcus recognized as copies of Zoe's school records, test scores, and teacher evaluations dating back 18 months. Your daughter is genuinely exceptional. Her academic performance places her in the top 2% of students in her grade level district-wide. The scholarship offer is based on merit, not on Ms. Carlyle's professional interest in your potential. Employment. Marcus studied the documents, seeing his daughter's capabilities reflected in numbers and assessments that confirmed what he had always known about her intelligence. But the knowledge did nothing to diminish his sense of being manipulated, of having his most important decisions influenced by information he had never possessed. Why didn't she tell me? Because she was concerned that you might view the scholarship as an attempt to influence your employment decision. She wanted you to evaluate the community initiative opportunity based on its own merits. Patricia closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming more personal than professional. Mr. Ellis, I've been working with the Foundation for 12 years. I've seen dozens of families struggle with the kind of decision you're facing, whether to accept opportunities that seem too good to be true. The unfortunate reality is that most people in your circumstances never get the chance to make that choice. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city that stretched beyond the financial district into neighborhoods where opportunities were scarce and potential often went unrecognized. Ms. Carlyle could have approached this differently. She could have mentioned the scholarship during your initial meeting, could have used it as leverage to encourage your acceptance of the position she offered. The fact that she didn't tells me something important about her character. Marcus felt his anger beginning to shift, replaced by a more complex mixture of emotions that included gratitude, suspicion, and the uncomfortable recognition that his pride might be preventing him from seeing the situation clearly, or it tells me she's better at manipulation than most people. Perhaps, but if so, it's manipulation in service of outcomes that benefit everyone involved. Your daughter receives an exceptional education. You have the opportunity to lead meaningful work that could transform communities. Ms. Carlyle's initiative gains a director who understands the challenges from personal experience. Patricia returned to her seat, her movement deliberate and measured. The question isn't whether Ms. Carlyle had multiple motivations for identifying your family. The question is whether those motivations align with your family's best interests. Marcus sank into the chair across from her, feeling the weight of decisions that seemed to carry consequences far beyond his ability to predict or control. The military had prepared him for leadership under pressure, for making choices with incomplete information while lives hung in the balance. But civilian decisions felt different, more personal, more complex, more vulnerable to misinterpretation and regret. What happens if I take the community initiative position and it doesn't work out? Does Zoe lose the scholarship? The scholarship is independent of your employment status. Once awarded, it continues through high school graduation regardless of any other factors. That's a firm commitment from the foundation. And if I decline the position but accept the scholarship? Same answer. These are separate decisions that happen to benefit the same family. Marcus considered the implications, trying to separate his emotional response from practical analysis of the opportunities being offered. The scholarship was undeniably valuable for Zoe, providing educational advantages that would influence the rest of her life. The community initiative position offered him the chance to do work that mattered while earning a salary that would provide his family with stability they had never experienced. The problem wasn't the opportunities themselves, it was the feeling of being maneuvered into choices that served someone else's agenda, even if that agenda appeared to align with his family's needs. "I want to speak with Ms. Carlyle directly," he said finally. Patricia nodded, as if she had expected this request. "She's available this morning, if you'd like to call her office." "No, I want to see her in person. Today. I'll make the arrangements." 2 hours later, Marcus found himself back in Vivian's conference room. The city view unchanged, but his perspective fundamentally altered by the morning's revelations. Vivian entered precisely at the scheduled time, her expression calm but alert, as if she understood that their previous conversations had been preliminary negotiations for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "You've been researching my family for months," Marcus said without preamble. "Yes, including my daughter's academic performance, our housing situation, my employment struggles. Yes." The simplicity of her admissions diffused some of Marcus's prepared anger, replacing it with confusion about how to respond to someone who refused to offer excuses or justifications. "Why?" Vivian took her seat across from him, maintaining eye contact with the steady confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. "Because identifying overlooked talent requires understanding the full context of people's circumstances. Academic performance, family dynamics, economic pressures, personal resilience, these factors all influence whether someone will succeed if given appropriate opportunities." She opened a laptop and turned it toward Marcus, displaying a spreadsheet that contained dozens of names, demographic information, and performance metrics. "Your family wasn't the only one I researched. This initiative required identifying people whose potential wasn't being recognized through traditional channels. That meant looking beyond standard indicators to understand how circumstances were affecting capabilities." Marcus scanned the list, recognizing several names from his community center conversations, people whose talents he knew were being wasted in jobs that required only a fraction of their abilities. "You've been tracking all of these people." "Tracking is the wrong word. Identifying, assessing, understanding, yes." The goal was to create opportunities that matched people with work that could use their actual strengths rather than forcing them into whatever positions happened to be available. Vivian closed the laptop and leaned forward, her expression becoming more personal. "Marcus, I could have told you about the scholarship during our first meeting. I could have used it to pressure you into accepting the position. The reason I didn't is because I needed to know that your interest in the community initiative was based on the work itself, not on side benefits that might influence your decision. And now you know everything. You can make your choices based on complete information rather than partial understanding." Marcus sat back in his chair, processing the shift from feeling manipulated to recognizing that Vivian had actually been protecting his agency in the decision-making process. "The scholarship for Zoe is real, regardless of what I decide about the position." "Absolutely. She earned it through her academic performance. My only role was accelerating the timeline for making the offer. And the community initiative is exactly what I described. $8 million over 2 years, 3 pilot communities, meaningful work that could transform how we identify and develop human potential." Vivian stood and moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the city view. I understand why you might feel manipulated, but consider this. Most people in your circumstances never get the chance to choose between multiple good options. The question isn't whether my methods were conventional. The question is whether the outcomes serve your family's best interests. Marcus found himself echoing Patricia Donnelly's earlier words, recognizing the wisdom in focusing on results rather than process. What happens next? That depends entirely on what you want to happen next. Marcus spent the weekend walking through the 3 neighborhoods he would serve if he accepted Vivian's offer, carrying a worn notebook that had belonged to his father, a mechanic who had believed in writing things down because memory could be unreliable when decisions mattered. Each community told a different story of economic displacement, but all 3 shared the common thread of human potential being wasted because circumstances had made that potential invisible to the people who controlled opportunities. In Millbrook, Ohio, he had conversations with former factory workers whose technical skills remained sharp despite 2 years of unemployment. They gathered at a diner that had become an unofficial job center, sharing leads and strategies with the weary camaraderie of people who understood that persistence was often more valuable than qualifications. Marcus listened to stories about interviews that ended the moment employers saw gaps in employment history, about skills that were dismissed because they came from industries that were no longer fashionable, about good people who had begun to doubt their own worth because the market seemed to have no use for what they offered. Detroit's Riverside neighborhood revealed a different kind of resilience. Here, the collapse of traditional employment had forced residents to become entrepreneurs. By necessity, creating small businesses, community gardens, and informal networks of mutual support that functioned like underground economies. Marcus met with community leaders who possessed sophisticated understanding of resource management, conflict resolution, and organizational development, skills that had been developed through necessity but had never been recognized in ways that led to formal employment or advancement opportunities. Eastland County presented the challenges of rural isolation, where capable people were limited not by ability, but by geography and the narrow range of local economic opportunities. He spoke with farmers who had adapted to new technologies, teachers who had started tutoring businesses, healthcare workers who had developed innovative approaches to serving scattered populations. Their insights into problem-solving and adaptation were impressive, but their location meant that most employers never encountered their capabilities. By Sunday evening, Marcus's notebook contained 47 pages of observations, ideas, and sketches for program designs that could bridge the gap between existing potential and recognition opportunities. The work energized him in ways he had almost forgotten were possible, engaging the strategic thinking and leadership instincts that had been dormant during 2 years of survival-focused employment seeking. Monday morning found him in Vivian's office again, but this time the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the uncertain job candidate seeking opportunities. He was a professional presenting analysis and recommendations to a potential partner in meaningful work. "I've been thinking about your 3 pilot communities," Marcus began, spreading his notes across her conference table. "The challenges are different in each location, but there are common patterns that suggest program designs that could be adapted to various circumstances." Vivian studied his handwritten pages with the focused attention of someone who understood that the details mattered more than the presentation format. Marcus had organized his observations into categories: existing skills that weren't being recognized, barriers that prevented those skills from being demonstrated, and potential partnerships with employers who might value capabilities over credentials. "This is impressive work," she said, looking up from a page that outlined potential connections between Millbrook's displaced manufacturing workers and technology companies seeking people who understood precision, quality control, and complex systems. "You've identified opportunities that weren't obvious in our original research." That's because your research was conducted from outside the communities. The real insights come from conversations with people who are living these challenges daily. Marcus moved around the table, pointing to specific entries in his notes. For example, in Detroit, there are at least 12 people running small businesses who have developed customer service, inventory management, and financial planning skills that would transfer directly to corporate environments. But they don't have traditional business education credentials, so employers never see their capabilities. He flipped to another section, one focused on rural challenges and opportunities. In Eastland County, the issue isn't skills, it's connection. There are people with expertise in logistics, problem-solving under resource constraints, and community organization who could excel in urban corporate environments if the geographic and cultural barriers could be addressed. Vivian leaned back in her chair, processing the implications of what Marcus was presenting. His analysis suggested that successful program design would require much deeper community engagement than she had initially envisioned, along with more sophisticated employer partnership development. How long would it take to develop this into a comprehensive program design? 6 weeks for initial structure, another 6 weeks for pilot implementation planning. But there's something else we need to discuss. Marcus closed his notebook and looked directly at Vivian with the confidence of someone who had moved beyond seeking approval to offering professional assessment. This program will fail if it's viewed as charity. It will also fail if it's designed to help people conform to existing employer expectations. The only way it succeeds is if we can convince employers that they need the talents these people offer, not that they should feel good about helping disadvantaged populations. The observation hung in the air between them, representing a fundamental shift in how the initiative would be positioned and marketed. Instead of asking employers to participate in social responsibility, the program would need to demonstrate that overlooked populations possessed capabilities that mainstream hiring practices were failing to identify. That's a much more difficult sell, Vivian acknowledged. It's the only honest sell. People don't need to be saved. They need to be seen. The moment this becomes a program about helping disadvantaged people, it becomes a program about managing social problems rather than developing human potential. Vivian stood and moved to her window, looking down at the city with the contemplative expression of someone processing complex strategic implications. The board presentation is scheduled for Thursday. If you're going to lead this initiative, you'll need to present the program design yourself. Are you prepared for that level of visibility? Marcus felt familiar butterflies in his stomach, the same sensation he had experienced before leading briefings with senior military leadership. But alongside the nervousness was excitement, the anticipation of engaging in work that mattered, of standing before people who could make decisions that affected lives and presenting ideas that could create meaningful change. I'm prepared. But I want to bring community representatives with me. This can't be about me explaining other people's needs. It has to be about those people speaking for themselves. The board members aren't accustomed to that kind of presentation format. Then maybe it's time they got accustomed to it. The next 3 days passed in intensive preparation that felt like the most engaging work Marcus had done since leaving the military. He collaborated with Vivian's research team to refine his community observations into professional presentation materials, but he insisted on maintaining the authentic voices and perspectives of the people who would ultimately benefit from the program. Tuesday morning, he returned to each community to invite representatives to join him for the board presentation. The responses varied. Some people were excited about the opportunity to directly influence program design, while others were skeptical about speaking to corporate executives who might view them as problems to be solved rather than resources to be developed. Sandra Williams from the Community Center agreed to represent urban challenges and opportunities, bringing her perspective as someone who had been underestimated despite possessing strong analytical skills and natural leadership abilities. Jerome Thompson would speak about veteran transition issues, drawing on his experience navigating systems that didn't recognize military training as relevant to civilian employment. Maria Santos would address immigrant talent recognition, sharing insights about professional people whose credentials weren't valued in American employment markets. Wednesday evening, Marcus met with his 3 community representatives to prepare for the presentation. They gathered in the Roosevelt Community Center, the same room where he had first outlined Vivian's initiative to a skeptical audience who had heard promises before. "Remember," Marcus told them, "you're not asking for anything tomorrow. You're offering something. You're presenting solutions to problems that these companies face: talent shortages, innovation gaps, limited perspectives in their workforce. The program succeeds only if it serves everyone's interests, not just ours." Sandra nodded, reviewing her notes about skills transfer and potential employer partnerships. "It feels strange to be going in there as equals rather than supplicants." "That's exactly the point," Marcus replied. "The moment this becomes about charity, it becomes about management rather than empowerment. We're presenting a business case for human potential investment, not making an emotional appeal for social assistance." Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn air and the weight of decisions that would affect not just Marcus's family, but entire communities of people whose capabilities had been overlooked by traditional hiring practices. Marcus dressed in the same suit he had worn to his aborted job interview 6 weeks earlier, but his posture and confidence were entirely different. He met Sandra, Jerome, and Maria in the lobby of Carlisle Technologies, noting how the building's marble and glass elegance didn't intimidate them the way it might have weeks earlier. They had prepared thoroughly, practiced their presentations, and understood that they were representing not just their own opportunities, but the potential of everyone in their communities who possessed talents that weren't being recognized through conventional channels. "Are you ready for this?" Sandra asked as they waited for the elevator. Marcus thought about Zoe, safely enrolled at St. Catherine's Academy, where her mathematical gifts were being challenged and developed. He thought about the eviction notice that no longer threatened their stability, the conversations with Mrs. Chen about dreams deferred, and opportunities that arrived disguised as interruptions. "I'm ready," he said. And for the first time in years, he meant it completely. The Carlisle Technologies boardroom occupied the entire 45th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city that stretched to the horizon in all directions. Marcus had been in military briefing rooms where billion-dollar decisions were made, but this space carried a different kind of authority. The quiet power of people whose choices affected markets, communities, and the economic futures of entire regions. 12 board members sat around a mahogany table that could have doubled as a landing strip, their collective net worth representing more capital than most small nations controlled. Marcus recognized several faces from business magazines and newspaper profiles: titans of industry, former cabinet secretaries, university presidents whose opinions influenced policy discussions in Washington. Vivian stood at the head of the table, her presentation materials arranged with military precision across multiple screens that displayed charts, demographic data, and projected outcomes for the Community Empowerment Initiative. But all eyes were on Marcus and his 3 companions, whose presence represented something unprecedented in the boardroom's corporate history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vivian began, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone addressing peers rather than superiors, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Ellis, who will be directing our Community Empowerment Initiative, along with Sandra Williams, Jerome Thompson, and Maria Santos. Representatives from the communities will be serving." Board member introductions followed with practiced corporate courtesy, but Marcus could sense the underlying curiosity about why community representatives were present for what should have been a standard program approval presentation. These people were accustomed to discussions about social responsibility programs that were designed by consultants and implemented by professional non-profit managers, not collaborative efforts that included the actual beneficiaries in strategic planning. "Mr. Ellis," said Board Chairman Robert Hastings, a man whose steel-grey hair and measured speech patterns suggested decades of high-stakes decision-making, "we've reviewed the program proposal and budget projections. The financial commitment is substantial. Help us understand why this approach will succeed where similar initiatives have failed." Marcus moved to the front of the room, his military bearing evident in the way he commanded space and attention. 6 weeks ago, he had been a desperate job seeker, willing to accept warehouse management to pay his rent. Today, he was presenting an $8 million initiative to people whose approval could transform thousands of lives. "The fundamental difference," Marcus began, "is that this program is designed by people who understand the challenges from lived experience rather than academic theory. Every component has been tested against the reality of what people actually face when they're trying to transition from survival to opportunity." He gestured toward his community representatives, each of whom had prepared to speak about specific aspects of their experience and expertise. "Sandra Williams has been trying to transition from factory work to healthcare administration for 2 years. She possesses analytical skills, leadership experience, and problem-solving abilities that any corporation would value. The barriers she faces aren't capability-related, they're recognition-related." Sandra stood, her confidence evident in the way she addressed the room full of executives without deference or apology. "I managed quality control processes for 15 years in manufacturing," she said, her voice clear and direct. "I supervised teams of 20 people, implemented efficiency improvements that saved my plant over $2 million annually, and maintained safety records that exceeded industry standards. When the plant closed, I was told my skills weren't transferable to other industries." She opened a folder and withdrew documentation that she had prepared for the presentation. "Last month, I consulted informally with a healthcare facility that was struggling with patient flow problems. Using the same process management techniques I applied in manufacturing, I identified bottlenecks and recommended solutions that improved their efficiency by 30%. The administrator was so impressed that she offered me a consulting contract." Sandra looked around the table, making eye contact with board members who were leaning forward with obvious interest. "The problem isn't that people like me lack valuable skills. The problem is that those skills are invisible to hiring managers, who can't see past industry categories and credential requirements." Marcus nodded, building on Sandra's presentation to address the broader program strategy. "This initiative succeeds by changing the conversation from how can we help disadvantaged people to how can we identify valuable talent that conventional hiring practices are overlooking. It's not a social responsibility program, it's a competitive advantage program." He moved to the presentation screen, highlighting data about talent shortages in key industries, demographic trends that were creating labor market gaps, and research showing that diverse perspectives improve problem-solving and innovation outcomes. "Jerome Thompson," Marcus continued, "will speak to veteran transition issues, but his experience represents broader questions about how we evaluate transferable skills." Jerome stood with the bearing of someone who had served his country with distinction and had no reason to apologize for the path that had brought him to this boardroom. "I managed logistics operations in combat environments where failure meant people died," he said simply. "I coordinated supply chains across hostile territory, managed personnel under extreme stress, and solved complex problems with limited resources and unlimited consequences." He paused, letting the weight of his experience settle over the room. When I interviewed for civilian positions, hiring managers focused on my PTSD diagnosis rather than my leadership experience. They saw my military service as a liability rather than evidence of my ability to perform under pressure. The boardroom was completely quiet, the usual corporate multitasking replaced by focused attention on Jerome's words. 6 months ago, I started doing informal consulting for small businesses in my neighborhood, people who needed help with inventory management, employee scheduling, and operational efficiency. Every business I've worked with has seen measurable improvements. Jerome opened his own presentation materials, displaying before and after metrics from local businesses that had benefited from his expertise. The question isn't whether veterans like me have valuable skills. The question is whether employers can recognize military leadership experience as relevant to civilian business challenges. Maria Santos stepped forward with the dignified bearing of someone who had spent years proving her worth in environments that questioned her capabilities. Her engineering background and immigrant experience represented challenges that affected millions of talented professionals whose credentials didn't translate easily into American employment opportunities. I earned my mechanical engineering degree from Universidad Nacional in Colombia, graduating with honors and working for 5 years on infrastructure projects that served rural communities. She began, her accented English precise and confident. When I arrived in the United States, I was told that my education and experience weren't recognized here. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a portfolio containing project documentation, technical drawings, and photographs of bridges, water, systems, and housing developments she had helped design and construct. For 3 years, I worked in retail positions while taking courses to meet American credentialing requirements. During that time, I volunteered with a nonprofit organization helping low-income families improve their housing situations. I developed energy efficiency solutions, designed water conservation systems, and created maintenance protocols that reduced utility costs by an average of 40% per household. Maria moved to the presentation screen, displaying technical diagrams and cost-benefit analyses that demonstrated sophisticated engineering knowledge applied to practical community problems. Last month, a local contractor hired me to consult on a housing rehabilitation project. Using principles I learned in Colombia and adapted for American building codes, I designed modifications that reduced construction costs by 25% while exceeding energy efficiency standards. She turned back to face the board members, her expression calm but intense. The issue isn't that immigrant professionals lack relevant skills. The issue is that our different educational and cultural backgrounds are viewed as deficits rather than assets that bring valuable perspectives to American businesses. Board member Jennifer Walsh, who served as CEO of a major construction firm, leaned forward with obvious interest. Ms. Santos, what would it take to create pathways for professionals like yourself to demonstrate your capabilities to employers who might benefit from your expertise? Marcus stepped forward, recognizing the question as an opening to present the program's core strategy. That's exactly what this initiative is designed to address, he said, moving to display program structure diagrams that showed how potential recognition could be systematized rather than left to chance encounters. The Community Empowerment Initiative creates demonstration opportunities where people can show what they can do rather than just talking about what they've done. We partner with employers who are willing to evaluate talent based on performance rather than credentials. He highlighted specific program components that had been developed based on his community research and collaboration with Vivian's team. For professionals like Maria, we create project-based consulting opportunities that allow them to demonstrate their expertise while employers observe their capabilities directly. For veterans like Jerome, we develop leadership assessment processes that evaluate actual skills rather than making assumptions based on military service. For experienced workers like Sandra, we design skills translation programs that help employers understand how capabilities transfer across industries. Board Chairman Robert Hastings studied the program diagrams with the analytical focus of someone evaluating complex business propositions. Mr. Ellis, this approach requires significant employer participation. What incentives can we offer to encourage businesses to invest time and resources in these demonstration opportunities? Marcus felt the familiar confidence of military briefings, where lives depended on clear communication and sound strategic thinking. The incentive is access to talented people who aren't available through traditional hiring channels. Our research shows that companies using conventional recruitment methods are competing for the same pool of candidates while overlooking substantial talent pools that could provide competitive advantages. He moved to economic data that supported the program's business case. Labor shortages in skilled trades, healthcare, technology, and management are costing participating employers significant money in recruitment fees, extended vacancy periods, and training costs for underqualified hires. This program gives them access to people who possess real capabilities but haven't been recognized through standard hiring practices. Vivian stepped forward to address the financial and strategic implications. The $8 million investment over 2 years is structured to generate measurable returns for both participants and employer partners. Success metrics include job placement rates, salary improvements for participants, retention rates for placed employees, and productivity improvements for participating employers. Board member Thomas Chen, who had remained quiet throughout the presentation, raised his hand to ask a question that Marcus sensed would be crucial. This all sounds impressive in theory, but what evidence do you have that this approach will work in practice? What makes you confident that you can succeed where similar programs have failed? Marcus looked around the room, meeting the eyes of board members whose approval would determine whether thousands of people received opportunities to demonstrate their potential. Because for the first time, the people designing the program are the same people who have lived the challenges it's trying to address. We're not guessing about barriers or making assumptions about solutions. We know exactly what prevents capable people from being recognized, and we know exactly what they need to succeed. He paused, feeling the weight of everyone's attention, focused on his next words. 6 weeks ago, I was one of those people, talented, experienced, capable, and invisible to employers who couldn't see past my circumstances to recognize what I had to offer. Today, I'm standing in front of you because someone was willing to look beyond traditional indicators to see actual potential. Marcus gestured toward his community representatives who had transformed the boardroom's atmosphere from corporate detachment to personal engagement. The question isn't whether people like Sandra, Jerome, and Maria have valuable skills. The question is whether we're willing to create systems that recognize and develop that value instead of leaving it buried under economic circumstances. The room fell silent as board members processed the implications of what they had heard. Marcus could sense decision-making energy building around the table, the kind of focused consideration that preceded commitments that would affect thousands of lives. Robert Hastings looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member before addressing the room. I'd like to call for a preliminary vote on program approval. All those in favor of moving forward with the community empowerment initiative as presented? 12 hands rose in unanimous approval, and Marcus felt something that had been broken inside him for 2 years finally begin to heal. 6 months after the board presentation, Marcus stood in his new office on the 32nd floor of Carlisle Technologies, reading the latest quarterly report on Community Empowerment Initiative outcomes. The view from his window showed the same city he had walked through as an unemployed veteran, but his perspective had fundamentally changed. Where he had once seen barriers and closed doors, he now saw networks of potential connections and opportunities waiting to be recognized. The nameplate on his desk read Marcus Ellis, Director of Community Empowerment, but the title felt less important than the results it represented. The program had exceeded its first quarter goals in every measurable category: participant engagement, employer partnerships, job placements, and salary improvements for people who had been trapped in underemployment cycles. Sandra Williams had been hired as an operations manager at Metropolitan Healthcare Systems, where her manufacturing experience had translated into process improvements that reduced patient wait times by 30% while increasing staff efficiency. Her salary had more than doubled, but more importantly, she was doing work that utilized her analytical capabilities and leadership experience. Jerome Thompson was consulting with 3 different companies on logistics optimization while completing a business degree that Carlisle's Education Partnership Program was funding. His PTSD diagnosis had transformed from a hiring liability into recognition that he possessed stress management skills that few civilian employees could match. The military leadership experience that had once made employers nervous now made him valuable to companies dealing with complex operational challenges. Maria Santos had joined a sustainable development firm as a project engineer, where her Colombian experience with rural infrastructure was exactly what they needed for international development contracts. Her different educational background had evolved from a credentialing problem into a competitive advantage that brought unique perspectives to American engineering projects. But beyond the individual success stories, Marcus was most proud of the systemic changes the program was creating. Employer partners were beginning to modify their hiring practices, developing skills-based assessment methods that identified potential rather than credentials. Community organizations in all 3 pilot locations had started similar initiatives, using the community empowerment model to create local opportunity recognition networks. A soft knock interrupted his reflection, and Marcus looked up to see Zoe standing in his office doorway, her St. Catherine's Academy uniform perfectly pressed, her backpack loaded with advanced mathematics textbooks that challenged her in ways her previous school never could have provided. "Hi, Daddy," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "I could come up and see your office before we go home." Marcus smiled, remembering when Zoe's biggest worry had been whether they would have to move again, whether his interviews would lead to jobs that could provide stability. Now she was thriving in an academic environment that recognized her mathematical gifts, surrounded by peers who shared her intellectual curiosity, preparing for educational opportunities that had once seemed impossible. "What do you think?" Marcus asked, gesturing around the office that represented so much more than professional success. "It's nice. Big windows, good view." Zoe moved to look out at the city, pressing her face against the glass with 7-year-old enthusiasm. "Mrs. Rodriguez says you help people get better jobs." "I help people get the chance to show what they can do," Marcus corrected gently. "Sometimes that leads to better jobs. Sometimes it leads to starting their own businesses. Sometimes it just means they feel good about their work instead of feeling trapped by it." Zoe nodded, with the serious concentration she brought to concepts that mattered. At 8 years old, she understood that work should be more than just earning money, that people deserved opportunities to use their talents in ways that made a difference. The office door opened and Vivian entered, her timing perfect as always. She had developed the habit of stopping by Marcus's office most evenings, not to check on his work, but to share observations about program developments and community feedback. "How was the Detroit site visit?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk while Zoe continued her examination of the city view. "Transformative. The Community Garden Cooperative has evolved into a small business incubator. People who started with agricultural skills are now developing food processing enterprises, restaurant supply operations, and nutrition consulting services. The skill translation is happening organically. Marcus pulled up photographs from his Detroit visit, showing community members whose vegetable gardening expertise had grown into entrepreneurial ventures that served their neighborhoods while generating sustainable income. More importantly, they're mentoring other people who want to start businesses. The program is becoming self-replicating instead of dependent on external management. Vivian studied the photographs with the satisfaction of someone whose investment was producing results beyond the original projections. The board is already asking about expansion timelines. Robert Hastings mentioned that 3 other corporations have inquired about partnering with similar initiatives in their communities. That's the real success measure, Marcus agreed. When other organizations start adapting the model instead of waiting for us to expand into their territories. They discussed logistics for upcoming community presentations, employer partnership developments, and participant outcomes that would be included in the year-end report to the board. But Marcus found his attention drifting to Zoe, who was now reading one of the community impact reports with the focused concentration that characterized her approach to everything challenging. As they prepared to leave for home, their real home now, a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood with good schools and parks where Zoe could play without Marcus worrying about her safety, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The decision to help a stranger with her boxes had seemed like a simple act of kindness, the kind of consideration his parents had taught him to offer without expecting anything in return. But that moment had opened a doorway to possibilities that had transformed not just his family's circumstances, but his understanding of how opportunities actually worked. Good things didn't happen to good people through mysterious cosmic justice. They happened when good people were positioned to recognize and seize moments of potential connection, when circumstances aligned with preparation, when someone with the power to create opportunities decided to look beyond conventional indicators, to see actual potential. "Ready to go home, princess?" Marcus asked Zoe, who had finished reading and was now arranging his desk supplies in patterns that pleased her mathematical sensibilities. "Ready, Daddy." As they walked toward the elevator, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the building's polished surfaces. A man in a well-fitted suit, carrying himself with the confidence that came from doing meaningful work, accompanied by a daughter whose future was bright with possibilities that had once seemed impossible. 6 months ago, he had been desperately hoping for a chance to manage warehouse inventories. Tonight, he was going home to prepare for a presentation that could influence national policy discussions about talent recognition and human potential development. Sometimes the best opportunities came disguised as interruptions, and sometimes helping others was the most direct path to helping yourself.